In the skis of World War II, speed was survival, firepower meant dominance, and durability could mean the difference between life and death. Among all the fighters that took to the air during the war, none embodied brute strength quite like the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was not graceful. It was not small. And it was never meant to be delicate. The P-47 was a hammer, built to hit hard, take punishment, and keep flying. When American pilots first laid eyes on it, many were skeptical. It was massive compared to other fighters of the era. German and Japanese aircraft were sleek and nimble, designed to turn tightly and climb quickly. The Thunderbolt looked more like a flying barrel with wings. But once combat began, that barrel proved nearly unstoppable. The story of the P-47 begins in 1939, as war engulfed Europe. The United States Army Air Corps knew it was behind. European air combat had revealed a brutal truth. Fighters needed speed, altitude performance, and heavy firepower to survive modern warfare. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, proposed something radical, a fighter built around raw power. At its heart would be the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, one of the most powerful radial engines ever produced. It generated over 2,000 horsepower, far more than most fighters of the time. To make full use of that power at high altitude, Kartveli paired the engine with a complex turbo-supercharger system. This allowed the P-47 to maintain performance at heights where other aircraft struggled to breathe. The result was enormous. The Thunderbolt became the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. Fully loaded, it could weigh over 8 tons. Critics said it was too big, too heavy, and too slow to climb. But Kartveli had built it for a different kind of fight. The P-47 could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. In a dive, it could outrun German fighters that tried to follow, sometimes pushing enemy aircraft beyond their structural limits. This made it perfect for boom and zoom tactics, diving from high altitude, firing in a single devastating pass, and climbing back up before the enemy could respond. And when the P-47 fired, it unleashed hell. 8 50-caliber machine guns lined its wings, firing thousands of rounds per minute. This was more firepower than most fighters carried at the time. Enemy aircraft shredded under the barrage. Trains, trucks, and ground targets were torn apart. But firepower was only part of the Thunderbolt's legend. What truly set it apart was survivability. The P-47's radial engine could absorb punishment that would destroy liquid-cooled engines. Pilots routinely returned with cylinders shot out, wings riddled with holes, control surfaces damaged, and still landed safely. There were countless stories of Thunderbolts limping home with half their tail missing or engines barely running. American pilots began to trust the aircraft with their lives. In Europe, the P-47 entered combat in 1943. Early encounters were challenging. Against agile German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190, the Thunderbolt struggled in turning fights. But as tactics evolved, its strengths became undeniable. Flying high above bomber formations, P-47s pounced on German interceptors before they could reach American bombers. As drop tanks extended the Thunderbolt's range, it became a vital escort fighter, protecting B-17s and B-24s deep into enemy territory. And when air superiority was achieved, the P-47 found its true calling. Ground attack. Loaded with bombs, rockets, and machine gun ammunition, Thunderbolts became airborne artillery. They hunted trains, destroyed convoys, smashed airfields, and shattered enemy morale. German troops learned to fear the distinctive roar of the Thunderbolt's engine, a sound that often meant destruction was seconds away. By D-Day and the Normandy campaign, the P-47 was indispensable. It flew countless sorties in close air support, ripping apart German positions and preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. In the Pacific, the Thunderbolt proved just as deadly. The P-47N variant, with longer wings and extended range, escorted B-29 bombers and supported island-hopping campaigns. Against lightly armored Japanese aircraft and ground forces, its firepower was overwhelming. Behind the scenes, the P-47 was also a triumph of American industry. More than 15,000 Thunderbolts were built during the war. Factories ran day and night, parts were standardized, maintenance was simplified. While Axis powers struggled to replace losses, the United States produced aircraft faster than enemies could destroy them. This industrial advantage, combined with a rugged design and well-trained pilots, made the P-47 a force multiplier. By the end of World War II, the Thunderbolt had destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. but perhaps its greatest achievement was something less measurable. It brought pilots home. Ask Thunderbolt veterans what they remembered most, and many won't talk about kills. They'll talk about damage and survival, about trusting the jug to bring them back when everything else failed. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the prettiest fighter of the war. It was not the lightest. It was not the most agile. But it was one of the toughest, deadliest, and most reliable aircraft ever built. A flying testament to power, endurance, and American industrial might. In the skies of World War II, when the Thunderbolt appeared overhead, enemies ran for cover, and American pilots knew they had a fighting chance. That was the legacy of the P-47. But the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt does not end with statistics or battlefield success. Its true impact can only be understood by looking at how it changed the way air war was fought, and how it reshaped the mindset of the pilots who flew it. As the war progressed, Thunderbolt squadrons developed a reputation for aggression. Pilots knew they could push the aircraft harder than almost anything else in the sky. They dove faster, attacked lower, and stayed longer over enemy territory than doctrine originally intended. The Thunderbolt encouraged boldness. Pilots routinely pushed their aircraft past limits that would have torn others apart. Compressibility in high-speed dives was a known danger, yet the P-47's strength allowed pilots to escape situations that would have been fatal in lighter fighters. Many learned through experience that if things went wrong, diving away was often the safest option. German pilots noticed. Reports from the Luftwaffe described the Thunderbolt as exceptionally difficult to destroy. Hits that should have caused fires or structural failure often did nothing. Even when damaged, the P-47 could still dive, still fire, and still escape. It earned a nickname among American crews, the Jug. Short for Juggernaut. As Allied air superiority increased in 1944, the P-47's mission shifted even further toward ground attack. This was not an accident, it was a transformation born of necessity. Once German fighter resistance weakened, the fastest way to cripple the enemy was to destroy their ability to move, resupply, and communicate. And no aircraft was better suited to that task. Thunderbolts attacked rail yards, bridges, fuel depots, and armored columns. They strafed roads until they were littered with wreckage. A single squadron could paralyze an entire sector of the front for hours or days. German commanders increasingly reported that daylight movement had become impossible. The P-47 did not just destroy equipment. It broke morale. Ground troops described the sound of approaching Thunderbolts as terrifying. The deep, thunderous growl of the radial engine became associated with sudden violence from above. There was often no warning, just screaming dives, explosions, and streams of tracer, fire tearing through anything that moved. In Normandy, during the breakout after D-Day, Thunderbolts were instrumental in preventing German reinforcements from reaching the front. Roads became death traps. Vehicles abandoned in ditches burned for days. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force, could do little to stop it. This relentless pressure shortened the war. While fighters like the P-51 Mustang often receive credit for winning air superiority, the P-47 won something just as important: air dominance at ground level. It turned the battlefield into a killing zone, where movement meant exposure. Even after the war in Europe ended, Thunderbolts continued flying combat missions in the Pacific. Against Japan's limited air defenses, the P-47's speed and firepower were overwhelming. Its ability to carry heavy bomb loads made it ideal for island strikes and close air support. And once again, it brought pilots home. Veterans would later say that flying the P-47 felt like sitting inside armor plating. It gave confidence, it allowed mistakes, it forgave damage. That psychological effect mattered more than any single technical advantage. When the war ended, the Thunderbolt did not disappear overnight. It continued serving in post-war air forces around the world. Nations that could not afford jet aircraft relied on the P-47 for years. Its simplicity, toughness, and reliability made it ideal for smaller air forces. Eventually, jets replaced it. But the legend remained. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved that speed alone was not enough, that agility without protection had limits. It showed that industrial power, engineering discipline, and survivability could shape the outcome of war just as much as individual skill. It was not designed to be elegant. It was designed to win. And it did. In the long history of air combat, few aircraft earned the trust of their pilots the way the Thunderbolt did. fewer still left such a lasting mark on the battlefield. The P-47 was not just a fighter. It was a statement. A declaration that the skis belonged to those who could endure, adapt, and strike back harder than ever before. And when it thundered overhead, everyone below knew exactly what it meant. For many pilots, the P-47 Thunderbolt became more than just an aircraft. It became a partner in survival. Trust in the machine shaped how missions were flown and how risks were taken. Where other fighters demanded precision and caution, the Thunderbolt allowed aggression. Pilots learned that they could stay over the target longer. They could press an attack even after taking damage. They could dive through flak, pull out late, and still live to tell the story. This confidence changed behavior in the air, and behavior in the air changes wars. The Thunderbolt also reshaped pilot training. American doctrine emphasized teamwork, discipline, and energy tactics. P-47 pilots were taught not to chase kills, but to control the fight. They attacked from altitude, struck with overwhelming force, and disengaged before the enemy could react. This doctrine frustrated German pilots. Luftwaffe aces who had dominated earlier in the war found themselves facing an enemy that refused to play by old rules. The Thunderbolt would not turn fight. It would not slow down. It came down like a hammer, fired once, and vanished into the clouds. And if a German pilot followed, the dive became a trap. The P-47 could dive faster than the enemy could safely pursue. German aircraft often suffered structural failure trying to keep up. Wings tore away, control surfaces locked. What began as pursuit ended in catastrophe. Over time, the Luftwaffe learned to avoid Thunderbolts altogether. That avoidance was itself a victory. Every German aircraft forced to disengage was one less threat to Allied bombers. Every train destroyed, every fuel truck burned, every bridge cratered weakened Germany's ability to fight. The P-47 attacked not just targets, but the enemy's ability to function. This was war at the systems level. The Thunderbolt did not need to dominate dogfights to be decisive. It dominated logistics, movement, and morale. It made daylight dangerous. It made roads deadly. It turned the battlefield into a place where the enemy could not breathe. By 1945, the effect was undeniable. German forces moved only at night. Fuel shortages crippled armored units. Reinforcements arrived late or not at all. Air superiority had become air suffocation. The P-47 was a central part of that outcome. Yet despite its size and power, the Thunderbolt never lost its human element. Behind every jug was a young pilot, often barely in his 20s, carrying fear, exhaustion, and responsibility into the sky. The aircraft did not eliminate danger, it reduced it. And in war, reduction is everything. Many veterans later said that when they climbed into a Thunderbolt, they felt safer than in any other aircraft they flew. That sense of protection mattered. It kept pilots focused. It kept them aggressive. It brought them home. Not all came back, but many did because of the machine they flew. When jets arrived and propeller fighters faded from the front lines, the P-47 quietly stepped into history. It did not end the war with a dramatic final mission. It did not become obsolete overnight. It simply gave way to the future, having done exactly what it was built to do. Its legacy lives on not in elegance, but in effectiveness. The Thunderbolt proved that survivability is a weapon, that durability wins wars, that air power is not just about speed and maneuver, but about staying power. It also proved something else. That a nation's strength is not only measured by courage, but by its ability to build, adapt, and sustain. The P-47 was as much a product of factories and engineers as it was of pilots and tactics. It represented the full weight of American industry turned into a single purpose. Win the sky. Dominate the ground. Bring the pilots home. That was the Thunderbolt's mission. And it succeeded. Today, when restored P-47s take to the air at airshows, their engines still thunder. Their silhouettes still command attention. They fly not as relics, but as reminders of a time when air combat demanded both courage and endurance. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be graceful. It was meant to survive. And in surviving, it helped win a war. In the years after the war, historians would debate which aircraft truly won the air war over Europe. Some pointed to speed, others to range, others to kill ratios, but pilots who were there often answered differently. They spoke of trust. They spoke of the feeling of pushing the throttle forward and knowing the aircraft would respond, of hearing rounds strike metal and realizing the engine was still running, of seeing holes in the wings after landing and understanding just how close they had come. The P-47 Thunderbolt earned that trust the hard way. It was overbuilt because it had to be. It carried more metal, more armor, and more firepower than seemed reasonable at the time. Critics called it inefficient, designers defended it, combat settled the argument. War does not reward elegance. It rewards endurance. The Thunderbolt embodied a shift in warfare, away from duels between aces and toward industrial-scale combat. It was not designed for individual heroics. It was designed to be flown day after day, mission after mission, by pilots who needed a machine that would forgive fatigue, weather, and mistakes. That philosophy saved lives. It also changed how future aircraft would be designed. Survivability became a priority. Redundancy mattered. Armor mattered. Firepower mattered. The idea that a fighter could be both fast and tough reshaped post-war aviation thinking. In that sense, the P-47 was ahead of its time. It was not perfect. No aircraft ever is. It was heavy. It drank fuel. It required long runways and careful maintenance. But it delivered exactly what it promised: dominance through power and resilience. As the war faded into memory, the Thunderbolt faded from service. Jets took over, speeds doubled, altitudes climbed, but something was lost in that transition: the sense of physical presence, of machinery straining against limits. The P-47 was mechanical honesty. You felt the engine, you heard the prop, you knew when it was hurting and when it could still give more. That connection mattered to the men who flew it. For them, the Thunderbolt was not just a weapon. It was shelter, it was reassurance. It was the difference between being shot down over enemy territory and touching wheels on a friendly runway. And for those who did not return, it stood as proof that survival was never guaranteed, only improved. Today, the P-47 Thunderbolt exists mostly in museums, photographs, and the memories of those who lived long enough to tell their stories. But its impact is still felt every time air power is discussed, not as spectacle, but as system. It reminds us that wars are won not just by brilliance, but by reliability, not just by speed, but by staying power, not just by daring, but by design. The Thunderbolt was not flashy. It was relentless. It did not ask for admiration. It demanded respect. In the roaring chaos of World War II, when the sky itself became a battlefield, the P-47 Thunderbolt carved its place not through finesse, but through force, and through the simple, brutal promise that it would bring its pilot home if there was any way left to do so. That promise defined its legacy. That legacy endures. Even decades later, veterans struggled to explain what it meant to fly the P-47 to those who had never experienced combat aviation. Numbers could describe horsepower, diagrams could show armor thickness, statistics could list victories and losses, but none of that captured the sensation of sitting behind 2,000 horsepower while flak burst around you and tracers stitched the sky. The Thunderbolt was loud in a way that stayed with men for life. Pilots remembered the vibration first. At full power, the aircraft did not merely move forward, it surged. The massive propeller bit into the air with brute force, pulling the entire machine ahead like a chain being yanked tight. The cockpit shook, the engine roared, and through it all the aircraft remained stable, solid, obedient. That stability mattered when fear set in. Combat flying was not graceful, it was chaotic. Sweat pooled in gloves, oxygen masks fogged, radios crackled with half-heard warnings. Pilots missed targets, misjudged angles, panicked, recovered, and tried again, all in seconds. The P-47 forgave those moments. Where lighter fighters punished mistakes, the Thunderbolt absorbed them. A missed dive could be converted into speed, a poor firing pass could be repeated, a damaged control surface might still respond enough to keep the aircraft flying. This forgiveness shaped pilot behavior. Thunderbolt pilots became aggressive not because they were reckless, but because they trusted the machine beneath them. They dove deeper, they stayed longer, they pressed attacks that others might abandon. German pilots noticed. Captured Luftwaffe reports increasingly described P-47 pilots as fearless or insensible to danger. But that courage was mechanical as much as psychological. The aircraft enabled it. As ground attack missions increased in 1944, the Thunderbolt's reputation grew darker. At low altitude, it became something else entirely, not a fighter, not a bomber, but a hunter. Columns of vehicles were spotted and attacked within minutes. Locomotives were destroyed in seconds. Bridges were cratered. troop movements froze in daylight. German units learned to recognize the silhouette instantly: the broad wings, the thick fuselage, the unmistakable sound. The moment that sound arrived, survival meant dispersion and concealment. Even then, it often wasn't enough. The Thunderbolt could loiter, circle, and return. It did not require precision bombing. Its guns alone were sufficient. Pilots described walking lines of fire across roads, vehicles, and rail yards, watching targets erupt under sustained fire. This was not romantic combat. It was systematic destruction. And it worked. By late 1944, German logistics were collapsing under constant air attack. Fuel shortages worsened. Reinforcements moved only at night. Commanders complained that daylight belonged entirely to the enemy. Much of that daylight belonged to the P-47. Yet for all its destructive power, the Thunderbolt remained deeply human to the men who flew it. They named their aircraft. They painted noses and cowls. They wrote messages to loved ones inside panels and on ammunition boxes. Some pilots refused to switch aircraft when offered newer types. They trusted what had already saved them. When the war ended, many Thunderbolts were scrapped within months. Others were sold, repurposed, or simply abandoned. The jet age arrived quickly. And with it, a new vision of air combat. But among those who had flown the P-47, something lingered. They remembered the weight of it. They remembered how it felt to line up a target, squeeze the trigger, and feel the entire aircraft shudder as 8 guns spoke at once. They remembered flying home with damaged wings, failing engines, and wounded friends, and realizing the Thunderbolt had carried them through again. History often celebrates the fastest, the most elegant, the most advanced. The P-47 Thunderbolt was none of those things. It was something more enduring. It was built for war as war actually exists, unforgiving, chaotic, and brutal. And it met that reality head-on. As the war pushed into its final year, the P-47 found itself flying some of the most dangerous missions of the entire conflict. The skies were no longer crowded with enemy fighters the way they had been in 1943, but that did not make the work safer. In many ways, it made it worse. The Thunderbolt was now flying low, slow, and predictable, exactly where anti-aircraft fire was most deadly. German flak crews had adapted. They learned the attack profiles. They learned the sound of diving Thunderbolts. They learned how to lay curtains of fire rather than aiming at individual aircraft. A single mission could involve dozens of near misses, fragments ripping into wings, control surfaces vibrating under shockwaves. Pilots learned to recognize the metallic thud of shrapnel striking aluminum. Sometimes the aircraft shrugged it off, sometimes it didn't. Yet again and again, damaged P-47s returned when logic said they shouldn't. Entire cylinders shot away, oil systems leaking, control cables hanging by threads, aircraft landing with wings twisted, tails shredded, fuselages scarred like they had been clawed by something alive. Ground crews stopped being surprised. They patched the Thunderbolts, rearmed them, refueled them, and sent them back out. The relationship between pilot and crew became sacred. Mechanics knew that their work determined whether a man lived or died the next day. Pilots knew that the people tightening bolts and loading ammunition were just as exposed to danger. Airfields were bombed, strafed, shelled. Many crews painted their squadron insignia not for pride, but for identification. In the chaos of war, it mattered to know which aircraft was coming back. And sometimes it didn't come back at all. Losses were still heavy. Even the toughest aircraft could not protect against a direct flak hit or a lucky burst from a hidden gun. Pilots disappeared over forests, fields, rivers. Some were captured. Many were killed instantly. The Thunderbolt did not make its pilots invincible. It made survival more likely. That distinction mattered. By early 1945, the P-47 was no longer just a fighter or a fighter bomber. It was an instrument of pressure. Every sortie compounded Germany's inability to recover. Every destroyed truck meant supplies that would never arrive. Every cratered rail line delayed reinforcements. Every fuel dump ignited meant vehicles abandoned where they stood. War became paralysis. German commanders increasingly reported units rendered combat ineffective not by enemy troops, but by air attack alone. Divisions arrived late, under strength, exhausted, and undersupplied, if they arrived at all. The Thunderbolt was not alone in this effort, but it was central. Its combination of range, payload, durability, and firepower allowed it to dominate a role that no other Allied aircraft filled quite as completely at the time. Pilots flying these missions often described a strange emotional detachment. At altitude, combat felt abstract. At low level, it became intimate. You could see faces. Vehicles burned where they stood. Movement stopped. Some pilots struggled with that reality after the war. Others accepted it as necessity. The aircraft itself carried no such burden. It did what it was built to do. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, many Thunderbolt units were still flying daily missions. Some pilots learned the war was over only after landing. Orders came down. Aircraft were grounded. Guns went silent. The suddenness was disorienting. Men who had lived at full intensity for years were told simply to stop. Thunderbolts lined runways, engines cooling for the last time. Some pilots walked around their aircraft, touching the skin, reading the stenciled warnings and kill markings, trying to understand that it was finished. In the Pacific, the P-47's war continued slightly longer, supporting operations against Japan until the final months. There too, it proved adaptable, surviving heat, humidity, and distance that punished less robust designs. By the time the war ended, the Thunderbolt had earned a reputation that transcended statistics. It was not loved because it was beautiful. It was loved because it brought men home. That reputation followed it into history. In the years immediately following the war, analysts tried to reduce the P-47 Thunderbolt to charts and comparisons. They argued over climb rates, turn radii, service ceilings, and kill ratios. On paper, sleeker fighters seemed superior. Lighter aircraft climbed faster. Narrower wings turned tighter. Jets promised a future where brute force would no longer matter. But those arguments missed the point. The P-47 was not designed for ideal conditions. It was designed for reality. Combat pilots rarely met enemies at perfect altitude, speed, or formation. They were tired, they were cold, they were damaged, they were surprised. And in those moments, the Thunderbolt's excess power, excess structure, excess firepower became decisive. American commanders eventually understood this instinctively. They stopped treating the P-47 as a compromise aircraft and began using it deliberately as a hammer. Missions were planned around what the Thunderbolt could absorb, not what it could avoid. That shift saved lives. The aircraft's radial engine, once criticized for drag, proved invaluable. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, it could take frontal hits without instantly failing. Bullets passed through cylinders. Shrapnel shredded cowling. Oil sprayed across windshields, and the engine kept running long enough to escape. This mattered more than elegance ever could. Pilots told stories of engines running on half power, entire banks of cylinders dead, yet still carrying them across the channel or back over friendly lines. Some aircraft landed with propellers frozen at full pitch, shaking violently until wheels touched the runway. Others never landed at all, but their pilots survived because the Thunderbolt held together long enough to bail out. That survivability changed morale. By mid-1944, Thunderbolt squadrons displayed a quiet confidence, not arrogance, confidence. Pilots trusted their aircraft the way infantry trusted good cover. It did not make them fearless, but it gave fear boundaries. You could push further and still come back. This confidence translated directly into effectiveness. Ground attack accuracy improved. Escort formations tightened. Losses dropped relative to sortie rates. Units became increasingly aggressive without becoming reckless. German pilots noticed the difference. Late-war Luftwaffe training documents warned explicitly against engaging P-47s head-on or attempting prolonged chases. Reports described American pilots who continued attack despite heavy fire and pressed engagements beyond rational limits. From the German perspective, this behavior seemed irrational. From the American perspective, it was calculated. The Thunderbolt could afford it. As the Allied advance crossed the Rhine, Thunderbolts flew missions directly ahead of advancing ground forces. Tanks moved behind airstrikes timed to the minute. Resistance collapsed faster than planners expected. Entire defensive lines disintegrated after repeated aerial punishment. The aircraft had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Even civilians recognized it. In liberated towns, people learned to identify the Thunderbolt by sound alone. Children pointed skyward when they heard the distant thunder. Soldiers on the ground felt reassured when they saw the familiar silhouette overhead. Air power became presence. and the P-47 embodied that presence. When newer aircraft began replacing it in frontline units, some pilots resisted. The Mustang had greater range, jets promised speed beyond imagination, but the Thunderbolt remained something unique, a machine that asked little and gave much. It demanded strength, discipline, and respect. In return, it offered survival.